The waves crashed against the rocky shore as a massive killer whale lay stranded, its powerful body trapped in the shallow waters. A small group of fishermen spotted it first, then came the tourists, and soon the entire town had gathered. Some took pictures, others whispered in concern, but no one knew what to do. The majestic creature's breaths grew heavier, its energy fading with every passing second. Would it survive? Would the crowd step in to help? Or was this the end of a magnificent beast? The orca's massive body lay motionless on the rocky shore, its glossy black and white skin gleaming under the relentless afternoon sun. The air was thick with the scent of salt and seaweed, but the most unsettling sound was the faint, labored breathing of the stranded creature. Every breath it took was slow and strained, a stark reminder that time was slipping away. The once mighty killer whale, a ruler of the ocean depths, was now a helpless being, caught between life and death. The first to spot the struggling giant was a group of fishermen returning from their morning trip. Their boat had barely docked when they noticed the unnatural shape lying on the shore. At first, they thought it was driftwood, a large chunk of debris washed up by the tide, but as they moved closer, they saw the slow, subtle movements of the orca's massive tail. One of the men, a seasoned sailor named Elias, dropped his net and sprinted toward the animal. "It's still alive," he shouted, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the gathering crowd. The news spread quickly, and within minutes, more people arrived. Tourists with cameras, local shopkeepers stepping away from their stores, even children on bicycles, all drawn in by the sight of a creature so large, so powerful, yet so utterly vulnerable. The crowd formed a loose circle around the orca, a mix of awe and uncertainty in their eyes. Some pulled out their phones, snapping pictures and recording videos, while others simply stared, unsure of what to do. The orca let out a low, guttural sound, not quite a cry, but something close. It wasn't just the sound of an animal in distress. It was a plea. A woman in a blue windbreaker pushed through the crowd, her face tight with concern.
"It's losing moisture fast," she said.
"We need to keep it wet." She turned to Elias, who recognized her immediately, Dr. Hannah Carter, a marine biologist who had spent years studying local whale populations. If anyone knew what to do, it was her. Without hesitation, she pulled off her jacket and knelt beside the massive creature. Its eye, dark and glossy, flickered open for a moment, as if sensing her presence. "We don't have much time," she murmured, mostly to herself. Then, louder, she said, "We need buckets, towels, anything to keep it from drying out." A flurry of movement followed. A young boy ran to his father's boat, returning with a plastic bucket. A group of teenagers grabbed empty coolers from their truck. Within moments, they were forming a chain from the shoreline, passing buckets of seawater down the line and carefully pouring it over the orca's drying skin. As they worked, Hannah examined the animal closely. It was a juvenile, not fully grown, but still enormous. "It's likely a young male," she said, running her hand gently along its side. "It must have come too close to shore and got caught when the tide receded." Elias frowned. "How long do you think it has?" Hannah hesitated, glancing at the sky. The sun was still high, but the tide wouldn't return for several hours. "If we keep it cool and wet, maybe a few hours. But it won't survive much longer than that." The weight of her words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. Keeping the orca wet was only a temporary solution. The real challenge was figuring out how to move it back into the water, a task that seemed nearly impossible given its sheer size. A young man with a baseball cap, who had been watching quietly, finally spoke up. "Could we try pulling it in with a boat?" Elias shook his head. "Too dangerous. If we pull it the wrong way, we could injure it even more." Hannah nodded. "And even if we could tow it, we'd need a way to keep its blowhole above water, or it could drown before it's fully back in the sea." The discussion continued as more people arrived, each offering ideas, some more practical than others. Meanwhile, the orca remained still, its body occasionally shuddering from exhaustion. Every few minutes, it would release a slow, strained breath, the sound growing weaker with each passing moment. Then, suddenly, a sharp gasp ran through the crowd. A little girl, no older than 8, pointed toward the ocean. Look, huh? All heads turned toward the horizon. In the distance, dark fins cut through the waves, more orcas, gliding just beyond the breakers. They had been there all along, watching, maybe even calling out. Hannah exhaled slowly, a flicker of something resembling hope crossing her face. They're waiting for him, she said softly. If we can get him back out there, he won't be alone. A renewed sense of urgency rippled through the crowd. The Orca's family was out there, waiting. But the question remained, how could they get this stranded giant back to them before it was too late? The tension in the air thickened as the onlookers processed what they had just seen. The Orca's family waiting just beyond the waves, calling for him. It was no longer just about saving a stranded whale. It was about reuniting him with a pod before it was too late. Dr. Hannah Carter wiped the sweat from her forehead, her gaze fixed on the juvenile orca. Its breathing had become slower, each exhale weaker than the last. The makeshift rescue team had kept its skin wet for the last hour, but they all knew it wouldn't survive much longer without returning to the water. Elias, the seasoned fisherman, adjusted his cap and exhaled sharply. We need to move fast. This animal ain't gonna last till the next tide. A man from the crowd spoke up, his voice uncertain. We could try pushing it. No, Hannah interjected firmly. We need to be careful. If we put too much pressure in the wrong place, we could damage its internal organs. A brief silence followed as they all searched for a solution. Then, a deep voice from behind them broke the quiet. What if we dig a channel? The speaker was an older man, a retired dock worker named Greg, who had seen his fair share of large sea creatures over the years. He pointed at the narrow strip of wet sand between the Orca and the ocean. If we dig out a trench and fill it with water, we could create a path for him to slide back in. A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. It was a long shot, but it was better than nothing. All right, Hannah nodded. We don't have time to waste. Let's get to work. The community sprang into action. Some grabbed shovels from their cars. Others used their hands to scoop away the wet sand. The fishermen, strong from years of hauling heavy nets, worked quickly, their muscles straining as they dug deep into the earth. The teens and children, eager to help, followed behind, pulling away debris and smoothing out the channel walls. Meanwhile, the bucket brigade continued their mission, pouring seawater over the orca's thick skin to keep it hydrated. The young girl who had spotted the waiting pod stood near the water's edge, her small hands curled into fists as she whispered, "Hold on, big guys." The digging was exhausting. The sun beat down mercilessly, and sweat mixed with sand, turning clothes damp and sticky. But no one stopped. As the trench neared completion, Hannah ran a quick calculation in her head. The path they had carved was deep enough for water to flow through, but it would take a strong wave to push the orca back toward the ocean. She turned toward Elias. We need a way to lift him into the water. Elias rubbed his chin, then snapped his fingers. I've got tarps in my truck. If we can get them under him, we might be able to use the waves to help roll him back. It was risky, but it was the best option they had. A few men ran to retrieve the tarps while Hannah carefully examined the orca's position. His breathing was even shallower now, and his movements had slowed to barely more than a twitch. Just a little longer, she murmured. Once the tarps arrived, a small group worked together to carefully maneuver them underneath the orca. They had to be careful. Any wrong movement could further injure the whale. It took multiple attempts, sweat dripping from their brows, but finally, the fabric was in place. Elias stood near the head of the creature, hands on his hips. All right, when the next big wave comes in, we push. Hannah looked out at the sea. The waiting orcas were closer now, their dorsal fins slicing through the water. They knew. They were waiting. Minutes felt like hours, but then, the water swelled. A large wave began to form in the distance, rolling toward them with force. This is it, someone yelled. The energy surged through the group. Hannah positioned herself near the whale's side, along with Elias and a handful of others. Everyone, push on my count. The wave crested, rushing toward the shore. 3, 2, 1,
push.
With all their strength, They pushed the massive body of the orca toward the water as the wave crashed over them. For a moment, nothing happened. The orca lay still. Then, with a weak but determined flick of its tail, it moved. The water pulled back, and the orca slid forward another few feet. Another push, another wave, another inch closer to the sea. The onlookers erupted into cheers, but it wasn't over yet. The whale needed to find its strength. The next wave came, bigger than before, and this time, the juvenile orca flapped its powerful tail with force. It slid further, half submerged in the water now. Hannah's hands trembled as she whispered, "Come on. You can do this." The orca's breathing was stronger now, its body no longer limp. With a final flick of its tail, it propelled itself fully into the water, disappearing beneath the surface. For a moment, the crowd held their breath. Then, just as the water settled, a dark shape emerged. The orca surfaced a few feet away, releasing a strong, triumphant breath of mist into the air. The crowd burst into cheers, some people hugging, others clapping wildly. The young girl by the shore wiped a tear from her cheek, her face lighting up with pure joy. Out in the distance, the other orcas responded, their whistles and clicks carrying through the air. The juvenile turned toward them, gathering its strength. And then, with one final look toward the humans who had saved him, the orca swam away, heading back to his family. The exhausted volunteers stood in silence, watching as the fins disappeared into the horizon. The rescue had been a gamble, a desperate attempt to fight against the odds. But in the end, they had done it. The town had come together for a creature that did not speak their language, did not share their world. And yet, in that moment, they had all been connected by something greater, a shared understanding that life, no matter how different, was always worth saving. As the last of the ripples faded into the ocean, the once stranded orca swam toward its waiting pod. The sight sent a wave of relief through the exhausted rescuers, their bodies aching from the hours of grueling effort. The crowd that had gathered erupted into cheers, some raising their hands in celebration, others wiping away tears of pure joy. It was a rare moment, one that reminded them of the power of unity and compassion. Hannah stood ankle-deep in the receding tide, her breath finally steadying. She watched as the young orca hesitated just beyond the breakers, its sleek black and white body cutting through the water. It was free, but something about the way it lingered made her uneasy. Elias, still catching his breath, came to stand beside her. "He should be swimming off by now," he muttered, his hands resting on his hips. Hannah nodded slowly. "Something's wrong." The celebration around them began to quiet as people noticed the orca's hesitation. The pod, which had been waiting at a distance, started to move in closer, their dark fins rising and falling with practiced ease. It should have been a moment of reunion, a swift and joyful return, but instead, the orca floated in place, making no effort to join the others. A ripple of concern spread through the crowd. A young boy, standing barefoot on the shore, pointed. "Why isn't he going back?" Hannah's heart pounded as she took a step forward, scanning the ocean carefully. The juvenile orca let out a low whistle, a sound of distress, and suddenly, the mood shifted. The pod responded with their own calls, urgent and commanding. And then she saw it, a dark shadow beneath the surface, something massive, something moving. Elias saw it too. What the hell? Before he could finish, the water churned violently, and the young orca let out a cry. It wasn't alone. Hannah's stomach dropped. "There's something else out there." The onlookers murmured in confusion, unsure of what they were witnessing. But Hannah knew. She had seen enough marine life to understand when something was wrong. Another orca surfaced beside the juvenile, larger, more battered, its dorsal fin slumped over. It was struggling, just like the young one had been. But unlike the juvenile, this one was still caught in whatever had trapped it. The pod had never been waiting for just one. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. They had saved one, but there was another. "Oh my God," a woman in the crowd whispered. "It's stuck too." The realization settled in like a punch to the gut. The juvenile hadn't hesitated out of fear or confusion. It had been waiting for help, just like it had received. A rush of urgency gripped Hannah. We need to get back out there. Elias looked at her, wide-eyed. Are you serious? That one's still in deep water. I don't care, she shot back. If we don't help, it won't make it. The town had already done the impossible once. Could they do it again? Some hesitated, uncertain. The second orca was far enough out that it wouldn't be as simple as digging a trench or pushing with the waves. They'd have to wade into the deeper water, find a way to untangle it from whatever was holding it back, and somehow guide it to safety. The fishermen exchanged glances. Then, as if reaching a silent agreement, they turned and rushed toward their boats. I'll go with them, Elias said, grabbing Hannah's arm. We're going to need you to guide us. She barely had time to process his words before she was running alongside them, her pulse pounding in her ears. The water was colder than she expected when she climbed into the fishing boat, but she barely noticed. The juvenile orca was circling the trapped one now, its calls more insistent. The pod remained close but hesitant, unwilling to get too near the shallow waters. Elias gripped the motor's handle. Tell me where we need to go. Hannah's eyes locked onto the struggling orca, noting the way it flailed and twisted. It was caught on something, but she couldn't tell what. Closer, she instructed. Slowly. The boat eased forward, rocking slightly as they approached. The trapped orca was massive, even larger than the young one they had just saved. Its skin bore signs of past battles, scars, scratches, the evidence of a life spent fighting the odds. And yet, here it was, helpless. The fishermen grabbed their ropes, readying themselves for whatever came next. Hannah leaned over the side of the boat, scanning the water. It's snagged on something, she muttered. Then, as the waves settled, she saw it. Thick strands of old fishing net, wrapped tightly around the orca's tail. Her heart clenched. Ghost nets. Elias's jaw tightened. Damn abandoned fishing gear. She nodded grimly. These nets, left behind by careless or illegal fishing, had claimed too many marine lives. This orca was lucky to have lasted this long. Can we cut it loose? Elias asked. We have to, Hannah said. The fishermen wasted no time. They threw their ropes into the water, securing the boat so it wouldn't drift. Two of them prepared diving knives, while Hannah focused on keeping the orca calm. It was weak, but still aware, thrashing every so often in distress. We need to move fast, she called as the men lowered themselves into the water. The cutting process was painstaking. The net was thick and tangled, wrapped tight around the orca's tail and pectoral fin. Every second counted. The juvenile orca swam anxiously nearby, never straying too far. The pod remained just beyond the boat, their presence an unspoken reminder of what was at stake. And then, finally, the last strand's cut, one of the divers shouted. Hannah barely had time to react before the orca gave one powerful twist of its tail, breaking free of the last remaining pieces. For a second, it remained still, as if unsure of its own freedom. Then, with a great burst of movement, it propelled itself forward. The water exploded around them as the orca surged toward open sea, its cries of relief and gratitude echoing through the waves. The juvenile followed instantly, swimming alongside it. And together, they disappeared into the deep, back where they belonged. Back with their family. The boat rocked gently in the aftermath, the fishermen catching their breath. Hannah exhaled shakily, overwhelmed with emotion. On the shore, the crowd erupted once more, watching as the orcas disappeared into the horizon. They had saved not just one, but two. And in doing so, they had proven that sometimes humanity and nature were not at odds. Sometimes they fought for each other. The waves settled as the orcas disappeared into the vast, open sea, their dark fins slicing through the water like whispers of gratitude. On the shore, the crowd stood in awe, watching the ocean reclaim what was once lost. The tension that had gripped them moments ago melted into an overwhelming sense of triumph. Hannah sat on the edge of the fishing boat, her heart pounding against her ribs. The adrenaline was still rushing through her veins, but the exhaustion was beginning to settle in. She wiped the seawater from her face and turned to Elias, who was gripping the boat's railing, staring at the horizon where the Orcas had disappeared. "We did it," she murmured, almost as if she needed to say it out loud to believe it. Elias let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Damn right. We did." The fishermen who had been in the water climbed back into the boat, their breaths coming in heavy pants. One of them, Greg, the retired dock worker, wrung out his shirt and let out a relieved sigh. "That," he said, "was something I never thought I'd see." Hannah smiled, feeling the same way. None of us did. The boat turned back toward the shore, where the crowd was still gathered, waiting to greet them like heroes returning from battle. As soon as the boat touched land, people rushed forward, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. A woman stepped forward and gripped Hannah's hands. "You saved them," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You actually saved them." Hannah shook her head. "We all did." The young girl who had first spotted the pod waiting offshore ran up to Elias and grabbed his sleeve. "Do you think they're okay now?" she asked, her voice small but hopeful. Elias knelt so that he was eye level with her. "Yeah, kid. I think they'll be just fine." The girl beamed, and her mother, standing nearby, placed a hand on her shoulder. "She's never seen anything like this before," the mother said. "None of us have." Hannah nodded. "Neither have I." The people of the town had come together to do something incredible, something they never expected to be a part of. And yet, they had done it. Not for money. Not for recognition. But simply because a life, 2 lives, needed saving. As the excitement slowly died down, the reality of what had just happened started to settle in. People started asking questions, some murmuring about how often things like this happened. Others whispered about the dangers of ghost nets and the human impact on marine life. A local journalist approached Hannah, a small notepad in hand. "Dr. Carter," she said, "I'd love to get a statement from you about what just happened." Hannah exhaled slowly, glancing back at the ocean before turning to face her. "The truth is, this isn't just a one-time thing," she said. "Strandings like this happen all over the world, and most of the time, no one is there to help. The only reason we were able to save them today is because people came together, because no one turned their back." The journalist nodded, jotting down notes. "Do you think this could have been prevented?" Hannah hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." The second orca, he was tangled in a ghost net, abandoned fishing gear left in the ocean. If it hadn't been there, he wouldn't have been trapped. It's a problem we don't talk about enough. Elias crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "And it's not just ghost nets. It's everything. Pollution, overfishing, boat strikes. People don't realize how much damage we do." The journalist scribbled furiously. "So what can we do? What's the next step?" Hannah looked around at the people still gathered, still talking about what they had just witnessed. "We educate," she said. "We talk about what happened here today. We make sure people understand that this wasn't just some accident. It was preventable. And if we don't start making changes, it's going to keep happening." The journalist nodded, thanked her, and stepped away to speak with others who had been part of the rescue. Elias turned to Hannah and gave her a small grin. You might have just started something." Hannah laughed softly, shaking her head. "I'm just saying what needs to be said." He nodded, his expression turning serious. "You're right." The crowd eventually began to disperse, but something was different now. People weren't just leaving with a story to tell, they were leaving with a new awareness, a new understanding of their responsibility to the world around them. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the ocean, Hannah and Elias remained by the water's edge. "They're out there now," Elias murmured, gazing at the waves. "Swimming free." Hannah smiled, the image of the Orcas disappearing into the deep still fresh in her mind. "Yeah," she said softly. And for once, we were on the right side of the story. The waves lapped gently at their feet, a rhythmic, endless reminder that the ocean would always call. And maybe, just maybe, more people would start listening. The last of the sunlight dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in deep hues of orange and violet. The crowd had mostly dispersed, leaving only a handful of volunteers and townsfolk still lingering near the shore. The energy that had once filled the beach, The urgency, the adrenaline, had now settled into quiet reflection. Hannah stood barefoot in the damp sand, the waves curling around her ankles. She watched the ocean with a sense of reverence, knowing that somewhere out there, the two orcas were swimming with their pod, free once more. It was a rare moment, one where humanity had done right by nature. Elias walked up beside her, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Hell of a day," he muttered. She exhaled a soft laugh. "That's an understatement." For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply listened to the steady rush of the waves, the distant calls of seabirds, the whispers of the wind against the dunes. Then, Elias turned to her. "You really think people will listen?" Hannah sighed, glancing back at the small group of remaining volunteers. A few were still talking amongst themselves, discussing what had happened, how it had changed their perspective. A little girl held her mother's hand, asking question after question about the orcas, about the ocean, about how they could help more animals like them. "I think some already have," Hannah said softly. "And that's how it starts." Elias nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, guess you're right." They stood there for another long moment before Greg, the retired dock worker, approached them. His weathered face was lined with exhaustion, but his eyes still held a spark of something Hannah couldn't quite place. "I've lived by this ocean my whole life," he said, looking out at the waves. "Seen my fair share of storms. Seen more than enough tragedies." He paused, rubbing the back of his neck. "But I've never seen anything like what happened today." Hannah tilted her head. "Good or bad?" Greg let out a breath of laughter. "Good," he said. "Damn good." Elias clapped him on the back. "Well, let's hope it makes a difference." Greg gave a small nod before stepping away, heading toward a group of younger fishermen who had helped dig the channel earlier. Hannah watched as he began talking to them, his hands moving as he explained something. "What's he saying?" she asked. Elias smirked. "Probably telling them how we all saved 2 orcas today."
She smiled at that.
The story would spread. People would talk about it. And maybe, just maybe, it would plant the seed for something bigger. Hannah knew she couldn't save every stranded whale. She couldn't prevent every net from being abandoned in the ocean. But today had proven that people, when given the chance, could do something extraordinary. And that was worth something. As the night deepened, the last of the volunteers packed up their things and started heading home. Hannah and Elias lingered just a little longer, both reluctant to let the moment end. "So," Elias finally said, kicking at the sand, "you heading back to the city after this?" She hesitated, considering. She had come here on what was supposed to be a short trip, just a brief visit to check on local marine life. But now she wasn't so sure she wanted to leave. "I don't know," she admitted. "I feel like there's still work to do." Elias smirked. "Thought you might say that." She shot him a questioning look. "Oh." He shrugged. "Well, if you're sticking around, I could use some help getting a local marine conservation group off the ground." He paused, his smirk widening. "And maybe giving a talk or two about, how to save whales." Hannah chuckled. "You want me to be the town's official whale expert?" "Hey, someone's got to do it." She shook her head, laughing softly, but the idea stuck in her mind. Maybe this place needed someone like her. Someone to keep the conversation going. Someone to make sure this wasn't just a one-time victory, but the start of something bigger. She turned back toward the water one last time, the moonlight glistening over the gentle waves. Somewhere out there, the 2 orcas were safe. Because a town had come together. Because strangers had chosen to care. Maybe the world wasn't beyond saving. Maybe it just needed more people willing to try. Hannah took a deep breath, feeling lighter than she had in a long time. "All right," she finally said, a small smile playing at her lips. "Let's do it." Elias grinned. "Welcome to the team." As they walked back toward the town, the waves continued their endless rhythm against the shore, whispering a story that would be told for years to come.